Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
At family dinner, Mom smirked and said, "Your sister turned out perfect, unlike you." And I felt that familiar sting that usually pulls me into a stupid argument where I list my receipts like a desperate accountant trying to balance a ledger no one intends to read. But this time I did not perform, I did not joke, I did not defend. I did not give her one more ounce of my energy. I stood up, stacked the plates the way I have since I was a teenager, said a calm goodbye that sounded almost polite. And I left her with her smirk while the table pretended to breathe again like nothing happened. You know how some families run on a script everyone pretends they did not memorize even though the lines come out on cue, where the golden child story gets told like it is national history and the rest of us are extras who should clap on demand. And how the person who keeps the group text organized, pays for the family streaming accounts, remembers birthdays, and drives the long way to pick up someone who forgot their own plans is somehow also the disappointment. That was me, the automatic cleanup crew, the driver, the "can you help me for a minute" daughter, while my sister Emily floated above the rules because the rules were written beneath her feet. Mom was never content with subtle praise. She needed an audience and a comparison. So Emily's job was brilliant while mine was fine for now. Emily's apartment was adorable while mine was good enough until you figure yourself out. Emily's choices were brave while mine were a lot, maybe slow down, and if I brought a win there was always a twist that made it smaller, like how the new role I fought for became that thing they gave you, or the raise I negotiated turned into, well, at least you can finally help your sister with her big year, and I learned to swallow the lump in my throat because fighting made me feel cheap and cooperating made me feel invisible, which is a hell of a choice. So when she dropped the line at dinner, the line she has tried out in softer versions for years, I realized there was nothing to explain anymore, because explanations never changed anything, and the most honest answer was to stop playing. So I stacked the plates not as a thankless chore but as a little ritual of closure, carried them to the sink without a speech, told Dad I would see him later, ignored Emily's wide eyes that asked me not to make it worse, and I let the room sit in that awkward silence they always used to punish me, except this time it was theirs to hold, not mine. In the car I did what I always do when I am shaking and want to run, which is to go through the practical checklist that keeps me from crying, and I reminded myself of the accounts I have been covering or managing because someone asked nicely. Or because it was easier than arguing, or because guilt is a clever currency in families like ours. So I opened my phone and I looked at the shared cell plan that included Mom's line, the cloud storage Emily never paid me back for, the family streaming bundle that somehow became my responsibility after a trial period that never ended, and the automatic transfer I set up last year when Dad had surgery and Mom said she would pay me back once the insurance sorted out the bills. And I thought about how many times the word help actually meant be quiet, be useful, and do not ask for thanks. I did not rage, I did not write a manifesto, I did not fire off an insult. I turned off the auto-pay for the extras that had quietly attached themselves to me like heavy little magnets. I changed the primary on the storage. I scheduled a polite cancellation for the streaming bundle at the end of the cycle because I am not cruel and I do not enjoy messing up anyone's week. And then I did the one thing I had been holding for exactly the right moment. The thing I never wanted to use because I hoped I would not need it, which was to forward a single email thread to my father, a clean thread with dates and names and simple lines that explain themselves without drama. The kind of thing that makes you sit in a chair and read it twice, because it shifts the center of the room. I have kept that thread for years, adding to the folder when new pieces showed up, not out of paranoia, but because when people tell you that your memory is wrong long enough you begin to keep proof just to know you are sane, and I chose one concise chain. The one that could not be spun or softened or redirected toward me, and I wrote a short note that said, "I am stepping back from the helper role. I need you to see this and decide for yourself how fair this has been," and I hit send without shaking, because for the first time in a long time I felt like an adult who was allowed to stop paying for the privilege of being mocked. I expected the usual blowback, the "why are you making trouble" script, the "you misunderstood" chorus, the "she did not mean it" spin, but I also knew that my father is quieter than my mother and not blind. And that when a quiet person sees something they cannot unsee, they do not yell, they move, and that movement changes everything in ways loud people do not anticipate because they are used to noise, not consequence. I slept better than I thought I would, not because I was triumphant, but because I was finished arguing, and in the morning my phone lit up with Emily's name and a message that did not come with the usual glitter, just a flat line that said, "Mom's locked herself in her room. What did you do?" And I looked at it for a full minute, thinking about how little I had actually done and how much weight truth carries when you finally set it down in front of the right person, and I typed nothing back. Not yet, because sometimes the smartest move is to let the silence do the talking while the next domino wobbles on its own. When Emily's text lit up my phone in the morning with that clipped line about Mom locking herself in her room and a demand to know what I had done, I stared at it and felt that familiar mix of disbelief and fatigue that has been my background noise since I was old enough to notice how our house ran on a scoreboard that no one admitted existed. Because what she was really asking was not about the truth I had finally put in front of Dad. She was asking whether I had broken the spell that kept me doing the invisible work while Mom curated the narrative where Emily glowed and I apologized for taking up space, and that question carried the weight of years where every family milestone, crisis, or inconvenience somehow ran through my phone, my calendar, my passwords, and my patience. If you want to understand how a quiet message can make a whole structure rattle, you have to see how the structure was built. So let me lay it out without drama, because plain facts do not need decoration. When Emily needed a ride to interviews, I took the day off and said nothing. When she moved apartments, I was the one who labeled boxes and forwarded mail. When Mom wanted digital photos organized for a slideshow, I spent weekends scanning while hearing about how Emily's career had momentum and mine should stop experimenting. When Dad had medical paperwork that terrified him, I became the portal and the translator and the person who held while everyone else praised the strong one who never seemed to break. And if something went wrong, it somehow lived in my column, while every success in the family ledger was framed as proof that Emily was, in Mom's words, proof that raising kids right pays off, which is not a sentence you forget when you are the other kid in that photograph. The favoritism was not a cartoon villain thing with a cackle and a cape. It was a constant hum that made me question my own hearing, a steady drip of comparison dressed as advice. The kind that sounds almost reasonable until you notice that you are the only one ever receiving it, and after years of being measured against a standard I was never invited to define. I started saving the small receipts because gaslighting runs on your willingness to let the details slide. I kept emails where Mom rerouted funds that were labeled for both girls. I kept the text where she told me to wait on a promised reimbursement because Emily's timing is more urgent right now. I kept the message thread where a bank transfer that had a tidy label for education holdover moved into a different account with a note that would look generous if you did not remember the original promise, and I did not keep these like a detective building a case. I kept them like a tired person putting pebbles in a jar so she can hear them rattle when someone says the jar is empty. Silence can be obedience or it can be strategy, and for a very long time mine was the first one, which made me useful but forgettable, until last night when I let it turn into the second one. So while Mom thought she had delivered the usual dig that would pull me into the same clumsy dance, what I actually did was end the dance entirely, and this morning I kept going in that same vein by drawing a line through all the places where my time, money, and bandwidth kept the family machine humming. I wrote a simple handoff note with clear bullet points in a shared folder that said Mom now holds her own passwords and appointments. The family plan is moving to her name as promised years ago. Emily can request her own cloud storage access directly from the provider. Dad has full copies of the medical admin notes along with contact names, and any temporary charges that landed on my card are now documented with dates, totals, and confirmations so there is no confusion about what was a gift and what was a loan, because confusion is the favorite hiding place of people who never pay you back. To be clear, I did not threaten lawsuits or stage scenes or call cousins to gossip. I simply replaced the fog everyone lived in with a short list of facts and tasks, and then I sent one quiet link to Dad because he is the only person in the house who reads slowly. checks twice, and does not clap for performances, which is exactly who you want looking at a timeline that starts with promises made and ends with promises adjusted until they no longer resemble the original words. And while that may sound clinical, there is an emotional earthquake that happens when the person who always says it is not a big deal, I can handle it, finally says I did handle it, and here is the invoice you have been avoiding. When Emily called, she skipped hello and went straight to demands, insisting that I tell her what I had told Dad because he was not picking up her calls, and she had a "we need to talk" message from him on her phone that made her stomach drop. And I listened to her the way I have always listened, but this time I did not rush to calm her. I asked her a single question that hung in the air longer than she liked, which was whether she remembered the fund Mom used to talk about when we were teenagers, the one that had a nickname and a promise attached to it, and there was a pause that I could feel through the line because she did remember, and she also remembered how that promise faded into a different story the year she needed a down payment and Mom found a solution, and I told her we would all be fine once the people who made decisions finally own them out loud, which is not an attack, it is a boundary. By the time we hung up, my phone buzzed with a new message from Dad that did not yell or accuse. It simply asked if I could meet him later without Mom, which told me the first domino had tipped and we were done pretending that everything smelled normal when the trash had been sitting in the kitchen for too long. And while I know that image is not pretty, I am not interested in pretty anymore. I am interested in clean. Which is why, before I left the house, I scheduled one last item in the family group thread, a short note that said all administrative favors will now require a written request with a start and end date, which sounds cold, but is actually kindness. Because kindness without boundaries is how I ended up subsidizing a story that erased me, and I am not funding that narrative anymore. And if you think that sounds like revenge, wait until you hear what Dad asked me to bring to our meeting. Because that is when the floor finally gave way under Mom's favorite version of events. When Dad asked me to meet him without Mom, I knew instantly that the quiet little email thread I had forwarded was doing exactly what I had always hoped it would do if it ever came to this, which was to take all the "she is exaggerating" comments and the "she is sensitive" excuses and pin them to a wall so they could not slide away anymore, because nothing I had written or said for years had ever stuck. But the neat stack of dates, numbers, and promises kept in her own handwriting did not need my commentary. It spoke for itself, and the fact that he asked me to come alone told me he was not just curious. He was finally ready to confront a truth he had probably suspected for a long time, but never had the courage to call by its name. I drove over later that evening with a folder I had been building slowly over the years, not with some mastermind plan of revenge, but with a mixture of self-preservation and proof for my own sanity. Because when someone has trained you to doubt every memory, you start archiving little things not because you want to get them one day, but because you need to reassure yourself that you are not crazy, and that is what my folder was, a defense mechanism that, over time, became the sharpest weapon I could have ever held without even knowing it. And when Dad sat down across from me in that kitchen where so many of our family fights had started, he asked for the truth in a voice that was steady but tired. And I realized he was not looking for gossip or an ally against Mom. He was looking for confirmation that the instincts he had buried for years were not just shadows in his head. So I laid it out slowly, not in an angry rant, not in the kind of emotional pitch Mom always accused me of, but in calm sentences that explained how the education fund set aside for both girls had been spent disproportionately. How medical bills that were supposedly covered by insurance were quietly rerouted to my card. How the so-called temporary advances never circled back to me. How the gifts she bragged about giving to Emily were often paid for through balances that came out of accounts tied to me, and how the narrative of me being careless or financially unstable was an easy mask for the fact that I had been propping up the whole house while everyone applauded the golden child for her discipline and success. Dad did not interrupt, he did not wave it away, he did not soften it, and when he finally spoke it was not with outrage, it was with a flat statement that told me the weight of years was pressing down on him, because he said, I knew something was off. But I let her handle it because it was easier, and that makes me complicit, and hearing him own that without deflecting felt like a crack in the wall, a sign that maybe I had not been screaming into a void all this time, and, while part of me wanted to cry from the relief of someone finally saying the word complicit, another part of me knew this was just the beginning, because the truth sitting between us was going to ripple through the family in ways that would not stop at sympathy. The plan, if you could call it that, was never to humiliate or burn everything down. It was to remove the scaffolding that had kept the lies standing for so long, and once Dad was on board, even quietly, the whole system that Mom had built on performance and narrative began to wobble, because Emily's perfect image was not just about her own choices. It was about the way Mom funneled resources, excuses, and applause to her while assigning me the role of fixer, failure, and fallback all in one. And when that structure lost its anchor in Dad's silence, the facade started to peel away faster than I could have orchestrated even if I had tried. The next step came quicker than I expected because Emily herself called again, this time sounding less like the confident older sister who always had a pat answer and more like someone caught between loyalty and panic. And she demanded to know why Dad was ignoring Mom, why he had walked out of the house without saying where he was going, and why he had told her that they would be having a serious conversation that evening. And I told her calmly that maybe it was time she heard the truth directly from both of them instead of living in the version Mom had fed her for years, and while she tried to laugh it off in that way people do when they are scrambling for control, I could hear the unease in her voice because she was starting to suspect that her pedestal was built on sand, and that maybe she was as much a pawn in Mom's games as I was, even if her role came with applause instead of scorn. When I hung up, I did not feel giddy or vindicated. I felt steady, like someone who had finally stopped juggling 100 fragile objects and set them all down on the table, because the truth was no longer mine to hold alone. And the most dangerous thing for a manipulator is not an enemy, it is exposure, and Mom was now exposed in the one place she never thought she would be, inside her own family, with no room left to spin, because Dad had the papers, Emily had the doubts, and I had no reason left to keep covering for anyone. The plan was never written on paper or whispered into anyone's ear, but it was alive in that silence at the dinner table, in the folder I carried into Dad's kitchen, and in the decision to stop fixing problems that I did not create. And as the night ended, I knew this was not about getting even, it was about getting free, but sometimes freedom looks like revenge when the people you step away from depended on you staying chained, and the best part of all was that I did not have to push anymore, because the dominoes were falling on their own, and I had finally learned how to stand back and let them. When people talk about families breaking down, they usually picture screaming matches, slammed doors, and dramatic ultimatums, but in my case the collapse was quieter and more unnerving. Because it started with a silence that stretched too long and carried a weight none of us could ignore. A silence from Dad that unsettled Mom more than any fight could have, and when Emily called me the next day with her voice tight and shaky, asking what exactly I had shown him and why he was refusing to sit down at the table with them like he always did, I knew that the first cracks were widening into something irreversible, and there was no patch or performance that could stop it this time. Dad had always been the background character in Mom's show, the one who nodded through her retellings, the one who made polite jokes when she criticized me, the one who stepped in with a mild, "let's move on," whenever things got too sharp. But the night after I showed him the folder, he broke the pattern completely by refusing to eat at the same table, by going upstairs early without offering excuses, and by leaving the next morning without telling anyone where he was headed, and that shift was more dangerous to Mom's hold than any explosion of anger, because she knew how to deflect noise, but she did not know how to fill silence when it came from her husband, the one person she always assumed would let her direct the narrative without interruption. Emily, caught in the middle for the first real time in her life, began reaching out in frantic bursts, telling me she had confronted Mom and been met with deflections, half-answers, and that tight smirk she recognized but had never before been on the wrong side of. And she admitted, in a whisper like she was confessing a crime, that she was beginning to wonder whether her picture-perfect reputation had been built on Mom's curation rather than her own merit, because when she asked directly about the education fund, Mom snapped at her, told her I was poisoning her mind, and stormed off, which rattled Emily more than she wanted to admit, since she had spent her whole life being reassured while I was the one chastised for asking the same questions. The irony was not lost on me, that the sister who had been the poster child was suddenly doubting her own pedestal, and while part of me wanted to say, "Welcome to my side of the table," I bit back the temptation, because gloating was unnecessary. The truth itself was loud enough, and I had learned that silence wielded carefully could cut deeper than the sharpest insult, so I simply told her to pay attention to what was being avoided, because avoidance is often louder than confession, and I left it there, knowing that her own curiosity would do the work that years of my arguments never could. Meanwhile, Dad asked to see me again, and this time he came with his own pile of papers, old bank statements he had dug out of the office desk, notes on transactions he had let slide because he trusted Mom's explanations, and a few handwritten ledgers that made it impossible to deny what had been happening. And when he showed me the mismatched withdrawals and the temporary loans that had no returns, he said, almost bitterly, that he had been complicit in the favoritism because it was easier to let her steer than to stand in the crossfire, and he admitted he had excused it for too long by telling himself it was just her way of keeping the peace, when in reality it had been her way of keeping control. And his voice was steady, but his hands shook, because admitting you failed to protect one child while watching another get crowned takes a certain kind of courage that only arrives when the evidence is undeniable. Mom, on the other hand, doubled down, locking herself in her room for hours at a time, refusing to speak directly to me, and sending group messages that were thinly veiled attacks, accusing me of tearing the family apart and of dragging Emily into resentments that should have been buried. But what she did not seem to realize was that the act of retreating into her room was more telling than any accusation, because it proved that confrontation was not her strength, manipulation was, and without control over the narrative, she had nothing left but isolation, which was exactly why Emily's panic was growing and Dad's patience had finally snapped. The collapse became public within the family faster than I expected, because Dad, no longer protecting her image, started making calls to relatives asking about past contributions and promised repayments, and once those conversations began, the web of excuses Mom had spun for decades began to unravel in places I had not even known about, like the small loans she had told uncles were for my tuition, but had actually gone toward Emily's down payment, or the birthday checks from grandparents that were supposed to be split between us, but had ended up only in her hands, and each new piece was another domino that fell without me touching it, which was the most satisfying part, that my revenge was not destruction, it was disclosure. And once disclosure begins, it multiplies on its own. Emily called me again late that night, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it, and she said, "I feel like I do not know our family at all," which was probably the most honest sentence she had ever said to me, and when she asked why now, why blow everything up, I told her calmly that nothing had been blown up, it had been rotting underneath us for years, and I had just stopped covering the smell, and while she cried softly into the phone, I reminded her that she was not the villain in this. That she had been a beneficiary, but also a shield, and that maybe this was her chance to decide who she wanted to be without Mom scripting every move. As I hung up, I knew the collapse was no longer mine to manage, because the truth was out, the silence had shifted sides, and the woman who once commanded the entire stage was now locked in a room with nothing but her reflection. While the rest of us stood outside finally comparing notes, and the beauty of it all was that I had not shouted, threatened, or stormed, I had simply stopped cooperating. And that simple refusal was enough to bring down the performance she had been running for decades. By the time Dad asked for one last sit-down with all of us together, not a holiday gathering and not a fake reconciliation, but a clear conversation with receipts on the table and no sidebars, I had already decided that my win would not be about humiliating anyone or collecting back every uneven dollar. My win would be about ending the job I never applied for and making sure the story that kept me small could never be told again with a straight face. So I walked into that room calm, with a folder in my bag and a simple decision in my head, because the power I had been giving away all these years was not the money, it was the silence. And once that was gone, the ground under Mom's confidence felt less like marble and more like thin ice that cracks even when no one jumps on it. Dad started by saying in a voice that sounded like he had rehearsed it to keep from shaking that the math was not a mystery anymore, and that the ledger of favors and promises had been tilted for a very long time. And he looked at Mom and said that the quiet had been loyalty, not consent, and that loyalty had run out the moment the truth was documented in black and white, and when she opened her mouth to spin. He lifted a hand and told her he would not be managing the tone of this conversation. To protect her feelings, since she had never protected mine, which landed like a door finally closing against a draft that had chilled the house for years. Emily, to her credit, did not perform either. She simply asked what could be done now that all the explanations sounded like excuses, and I realized we were closer to a real shift than I had believed possible, because for the first time the three of us were talking about outcomes rather than optics. I told them I had no interest in dragging the past through any courtroom or turning our phones into a family scandal machine, that I was not here to get even, I was here to get out. And that I would consider every old imbalance settled as a gift I am choosing to stop giving, on 3 non-negotiables that would turn the lights on permanently. First, the narrative dies today, which means no more perfect sister jokes or failed daughter digs in any room, text, or family thread, and if it is attempted, I will respond once with the folder link and then disengage completely. Second, all administrative roles that have kept me glued to this family like a free employee end today, which means Mom manages her own accounts, Emily files her own requests, and Dad keeps copies of everything without funneling back to me. Third, any future help from me will be written, time-bounded, and voluntary, not implied by guilt or silence, and anyone who tries to reframe my boundaries as coldness will receive the simple answer that love without boundaries is just another word for unpaid labor, and I am retired from that. Mom laughed in that sharp way that used to make me feel 12 and clumsy, and she said I was being dramatic and that families do not run on contracts, they run on loyalty. And I told her that loyalty without accountability is how people like me end up subsidizing other people's reputations while being called unstable for daring to mention the bill, and that I was not negotiating the terms of my dignity anymore. And I watched her face when Dad quietly put a folder of his own on the table with account changes, beneficiary updates, and a simple note that he would be handling the remaining balances between him and me without her management. And the look was not anger so much as confusion that the audience had left the theater while the lead was still delivering monologues, which is the precise moment a performance ends and reality begins. Emily asked what I wanted from her specifically, and I told her the truth she probably needed more than I did, which was that I did not want apologies or repayment plans dressed up as sisterly bonding. I wanted her to be a grown woman who sees where her advantage came from and decides to build a life that does not require anyone else to shrink, and if that meant she needed to sit in discomfort for a while and redraw lines with Mom, then that was the price of keeping her integrity, and I could not do that for her. I could only stop cushioning the landing every time a bad choice hit the floor, and while her eyes filled in a way I had not seen since we were kids, she nodded and said she understood that my help had always come at the cost of my silence, and that my silence was gone now, which was the closest thing to an apology I actually believed. The final move happened not with a mic drop, but with a single message I sent right there, with everyone watching, to the larger family thread where the holiday invites and the bragging newsletters used to fly around like confetti. A message that said I was stepping down permanently from the helper role, that the group now had a shared folder with instructions and contacts so no one needed me as the bottleneck, that I wished everyone well and would see them as a sister and a daughter but not as a secretary, and that any future conversations about me would include me, or they would include my silence and my silence only. And then I attached a 1-page note titled Corrections that listed, in plain language and without venom, The truth about the education fund, the reimbursements that never came, and the way my work had been framed as instability to keep a particular story intact, and I pressed send without drama, because the point was not to shock people. The point was to put the final version of events somewhere permanent where it could not be misquoted again. Mom did what she does when she cannot control the room. She retreated and sent a careful line about misunderstandings and intentions and hurt feelings, but it landed with a dull thud because the scaffolding that once held her version in place was gone. And the relatives who used to clap for the glossy updates responded with either uncomfortable silence or with quiet notes to me saying they had wondered for years why the math never matched, and while I did not need their validation to breathe, it did something useful inside me. It replaced the old ache with a clean space where I could put the simplest sentence I have ever owned, which is that I did not ruin my family. I stopped underwriting a lie. I left that day without a victory dance and without a single receipt still in my bag, because the receipts now lived where they belonged, in shared daylight, and the work of carrying everyone else's comfort had finally ended. And on the drive home, Emily texted that she was taking over her own bills and that she would be talking to Mom on her own terms. And Dad texted a photo of a small handwritten note he had taped inside the office drawer that said "No more secrets." And Mom did not text me at all, which I took less as a wound and more as proof that I had won the only way I wanted to win, by building a life where I am not waiting for her to be someone she has never been. And if you are wondering whether it went too far, I can only tell you that sometimes the most radical justice looks like refusing to play a rigged game, and that the moment you stop playing, the person who wrote the rules calls you cruel while the rest of the room exhales and finally starts telling the truth, which is not pretty or polite, but it is freedom, and I will take freedom over applause every day of my life.